NATO, although it's North Atlantic Treaty Organization, supposedly, it's the United States, it's Canada and European states. Most European states are member states. But even though it claims that it has that kind of wider membership and it's trying to pull in countries from other parts of the world now as well, in reality, it's just a kind of an extension of US foreign and military policy. And it's been quite interesting to see how in the last few years, the Americans have really tried to get Europe to ramp up its military spending, to in excess of 2% of GDP. But the reality is, whoever is a member on paper, they are being led by US goals.
Hello and welcome to the Global Majority for Peace podcast. My name is Fiona Edwards and my co-host is Ileana Chan. This podcast is brought to you every fortnight where we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement against the US-led war drive against China, Russia and countries in the global south. If you like what you hear, please do subscribe to this channel so you receive a notification when we release new episodes. And if you appreciate our work, you can support us by becoming a member of Empire Watch on Patreon, and the link to this is in the description of this episode below. Your support is absolutely vital to build this movement.
We are delighted that joining us today as our special guest is Kate Hudson. Kate Hudson is the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, an organization which has been at the forefront of campaigning for peace and against nuclear weapons and war in Britain for decades. Kate is an historian and an author of a number of books, including CND at 60, Britain's most enduring mass movement. Kate, we are so happy to have you on the show.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me.
Brilliant. Well, we'll start with something quite heavy, I think, which is our first question. Always good to keep it heavy to begin with. So we're living through really quite perilous times at the moment. We have a situation in the world where the United States is leading a global war drive. And unfortunately, the countries in the global north, including Britain, are lining up behind this. And this year, 2024, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has set the Doomsday Clock at 90 seconds to midnight and is warning humanity that we're on an ominous course towards global catastrophe. So, Kate, I was wondering if you could talk us through what this means and how concerned should we be about a potential nuclear war breaking out at this time?
We should be very, very concerned indeed. Of course, it's really important to hear from those scientists. They are the top experts. Loads and loads of people now, commentators, media, everybody is referring now to the possibility of World War III. And of course, we know that that would be a nuclear war. So we have to take incredibly seriously. And just to look at the Doomsday Clock thing, just very briefly, because this is an incredibly important kind of metaphor that's been with us now for several decades. At the height of the Cold War, the US atomic scientists, they got together and said, look, we're really close to mass extinction, annihilation, global catastrophe leading to extinctions and mass killings and so on, threatening all life forms on Earth. We need to make people aware of this. We need to really raise the profile. And so what they did was every year they set the hands on the clock either closer to midnight, being the annihilation moment, or further away from midnight. And at some points it got to like 1:45 midnight, at safer points. There were kind of détente moments during the Cold War when they moved back and so on. But this 90 seconds to midnight is the closest that they have ever been. Even during the height of the Cold War, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, they were never that close. And this is a really, really dangerous situation. In terms of what they take into account, and I do recommend people going online to read the kind of very detailed kind of description and analysis from the scientists as to why they've got the hands at this point. It's very, very engaging, very readable. Do please look that up. But they got nuclear war there as really top of the tree there in global threats. But of course, they've also got climate catastrophe there as well. And what they do is they link the two things and show how nuclear war and climate catastrophe, war drives, and so on. They are all driving us in this direction of global annihilation. And they look at other elements as well. They look at cyber warfare, they look at AI, all the different ways in which leaders, supposed leaders of countries, are driving us towards absolute catastrophe.
Thank you for that explanation. In Europe, we are facing a dire situation where the largest war since 1945 is raging in Ukraine with absolutely devastating consequences. And probably one of the factors that you were talking about on the Doomsday Clock, I'm guessing. In this war, a nuclear-armed NATO and a nuclear-armed Russia are in direct military conflict with all the risks of that. That instead of taking steps to bring this war to an end, the US, Britain, and NATO are escalating it. Why, in your opinion, is NATO escalating this war instead of pushing for peace? And in your view, what is a realistic pathway for peace?
Well, that's the big question. That's the really big question facing us today. And just very briefly, I'm sure everyone who's watching this who lives in Britain will have been absolutely appalled by the really bad negative role played by our government earlier on in the war. And I think people will probably remember that Boris Johnson, who was Prime Minister at that time, became revealed that he had actively sabotaged the possibility of peace talks. So Britain, although we're not by any means the biggest player or the biggest military actor in this, the way in which Britain has given kind of political support to this terrible war and the continuation of this terrible war, I think is really, really deeply shocking. In terms of the wider picture, well, first of all, just to say something about NATO, because NATO, although it's North Atlantic Treaty Organization, supposedly, it's the United States, it's Canada and European states. Most European states are member states. But even though it claims that it has that kind of wider membership and it's trying to pull in countries from other parts of the world now as well, in reality, it's just a kind of an extension of US foreign and military policy. And it's been quite interesting to see how in the last few years, the Americans have really tried to get Europe to ramp up its military spending, to in excess of 2% of GDP. But the reality is whoever is a member on paper, they are being led by US goals. I suppose in terms of what are the US goals, I always find it incredibly useful to actually look back quite a long way, but I think it still holds true. At the end of the Cold War, the United States looked at the world and what was going on, and they saw that they were the single superpower and they liked it. Basically, they'd spent the whole period since the end of the Second World War trying to knock out the Soviet Union. Now that had happened, and they wanted just to stay top dog. And this is enshrined in a document at that time, which became known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine in 1992, I think it was, very soon after the end of the Cold War. Peace movement people, normal, sensible people were saying, look, the Warsaw Pact has ended. That was, Soviet equivalent of NATO. So let's just get rid of NATO, have a new world order of peace. We can have a peace dividend and stop spending so much money on weapons and so on. But no, the United States wanted to continue with NATO and continue along the Wolfowitz lines, which is essentially we will do whatever is necessary, the US will do whatever is necessary to remain the single superpower. And I think in the 30-odd years that have followed that is exactly what they have done. I think it's pretty clear that still shapes what they're doing. And of course, today, as we know, their main concern, the main kind of what they kind of set up as a rival is, of course, China, essentially a kind of fast developing economy, doing very well in terms of bringing its people out of terrible poverty and hardship, so they want to obviously keep China down. En route, would be quite happy to knock out Russia as well. I mean, they pretty much knocked it out through their economic policies, IMF economic policies in the 1990s. It's come back somewhat through the development of its economy and so on. So now they're quite happy to use military methods to try and knock Russia out of the kind of the game, the big power game as well. And they've done that primarily by the expansion of NATO. So from the 90s onwards, from 1999, when they had first wave of NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, there have been subsequent waves ever since. So now former Soviet republics, the Baltic states, they are now members of NATO and so on. So this has obviously concerned Russia. I mean, how anyone could look at a map and see all this and also the US bases and not understand what that global dynamic is, I do not know. Maybe people don't like looking at maps, but obviously they've had Russia as a focus in terms of the role of NATO, particularly during the kind of first 20 years after the end of the Cold War. Of course, subsequently, they tried to go global, getting partner organizations, partner countries, I should say, in Latin America and elsewhere involved. But that kind of focus on keeping Russia down and preventing China coming up, that's pretty much US foreign policy in a nutshell. And that is the NATO agenda too. And Britain's, of course, as well, as US number one ally tailing along there.
That's a brilliant history there, Kate. We're going to kind of pick your brains again on a historic topic as well, because you mentioned before how, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the world came quite close to nuclear war. Also in the 1980s, the threat of nuclear war was also very high on the agenda because you had NATO's decision to site cruise missiles in Europe as part of its Cold War on the Soviet Union. So I was wondering if you could share with us, what lessons we can learn from these historic events in terms of building a mass movement for peace today.
Yeah, I mean, you said that it was NATO wanting to bring cruise missiles to Europe. I mean, technically that was correct, but of course it was all driven by the US, very much so. What was very interesting about that was how rapidly the population in Western Europe understood exactly what this meant and what this sighting of US cruise missiles in Western Europe, Britain, of course, as well, what that meant was that in any nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States, or Soviet Union and NATO, that war would be fought in Europe. It wouldn't be kind of continent to continent with big missiles going over. It would actually be fought in Europe. And we were all at that time in the 80s very alert to and aware of what a nuclear war would be. I mean, in terms of popular culture at that time, the awareness and kind of portrayal of nuclear war and what it would mean was really, really high up there. I mean, there were some incredible films, cartoon films, novels, all kinds of things that really brought home to people what the reality of nuclear war would be. And we were all terrified. I mean, that's the reality of it. We were terrified. And so there was a kind of massive upsurge or kind of like organic grassroots upsurge of campaigns or different local groups being set up by local people, such and such a village against the missiles and, high street, whatever, against cruise and so on. And because of the nature of the movement at that time, in other words, CND was the anti-nuclear, anti-war movement, which everyone was aware of and could relate to. CND kind of opened its kind of arms and embraced all these new groups. And there was no attempt to say, it has to be CND that's doing it. You have to come in behind us. All these things were spontaneous. And the leadership at that time, particularly Bruce Kent, some people may remember the late, great Bruce Kent, it was like, okay, join us, you're very welcome. And so there was a huge groundswell. And at that time, CND probably got us up to kind of 250,000 members, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands or so, local groups. So these are all things that I'm thinking are things for us to learn from today, while I'm talking about them, but diverse campaigning methods as well. So the anti-nuclear movement in the 80s is so well remembered for things like peace camps, for example, non-violent direct action. So yes, there was a huge important role for big mass demonstrations. I mean, the CND demonstrations at that time were the biggest demonstrations in British history prior to the Don't Attack Iraq demonstration on the 15th of February 2003. So they were absolutely enormous, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people on them. So they were really important. The peace camps were really important. And then all kinds of different kind of sectoral interests, like doctors against crews, vets against crews, everything you could possibly imagine, because that was the scale of the fear and the concern kind of went down into every level and every section of society. And I think that is what we need to do today. That is what has to happen today. A kind of very inclusive, very diverse campaign, different methods. I mean, just think in terms of the different methods thing, it just reminds me of the recent incredible mobilizations against the genocide in Gaza. You know, at different points, there have been all kinds of different activities, like the student encampments, like the station occupations, you know, all kinds of different ways. And school students doing stuff as well as university students, you know, parents for Palestine we have now. So there's a kind of parallel to the kind of scale and depth of the protests and this kind of diversity of the protests in the 80s to what we're seeing today. So I think that when we're building the movement today, making links as well, that's really important. So it's not just like nukes, they're in a kind of box on their own that we're concerned about. We're concerned about acceleration of militarization in Europe because of the war in Ukraine. We're concerned about military spending, you know, all kinds of things. And of course, climate change, the carbon footprint of nuclear and the military, all those things, we have to bring them together and not be kind of purist about we can only talk about nukes. CND is very committed to making the links and bringing everyone out onto these protests and expressing their concern, bringing them into the movement and having the most inclusive and diverse mobilizations that we can.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear you talk about what it was like before and now. I think what really strikes me is that there does seem to be, I mean, I suppose this is a systematic whitewashing of nuclear weapons. And I don't even think, for example, that a lot of people might not know that the 6th and 9th of August, which is only last week, it was that anniversary of the US dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. So I think the systematic propaganda, the whitewashing of these historical events, I mean, in my rather less informed opinion, it seems to be quite successful. I would like to hear from you really what you think about how successful that has been and where we are at right now.
Well, ever since those bombs were dropped, I mean, this was the United States dropping nuclear bombs on civilian populations, right? War crimes on a kind of massive, massive scale. That's the first thing to say. Ever since then, there's been this myth that has been kind of perpetuated, which was that it was necessary to drop the bombs to end the war. Okay, that's the myth. And it is completely false. And it's false because it is well known, there is a huge amount of evidence that Japan was already trying to surrender from early in 1945, even before victory in Europe. And they only had one condition, which was that they wanted the emperor to stay in place and not be convicted of war crimes. Now, you may remember that the emperor, even after the atomic bombing and the complete end of the war, he remained in post and wasn't convicted of war crimes. So that was clearly no obstacle. That was no obstacle whatsoever to negotiating and accepting a Japanese surrender. But the Western powers brushed that under the carpet. I'm talking about the US, basically, because they were in the driving seat on this. They brushed that under the carpet. They ignored that and they went ahead with their plans. Now, I should say that although there are plenty of people, you know, CND and other organizations, a lot of American historians and so on who have this information and they put it out there, but it's not just people like us who know it wasn't necessary to end the war. People like Winston Churchill, for example, at the time, and very, very major political figures and military figures said, no, we didn't need to hit them with that terrible thing or something. You know, it was recognized. So that leads to a question then. Why did the United States do that if it wasn't necessary? You know, they claimed they did it because they wanted to stop hundreds of thousands of US troops being killed in kind of taking over of invasion and taking over of Japan. That was what they claimed. But so there are a couple of reasons why it's thought or it's shown that they took that position. One was because the Soviet Union had agreed that it would come into the war on Japan after a certain date if Japan hadn't, surrender hadn't taken place. That date for Japanese, for Soviet involvement was coming very rapidly. So they wanted to do something very quick to prevent the Soviet Union, the Red Army, with its remarkable record, in defeating the Nazis in the West. They wanted to kind of prevent the Soviet Union, being part of, say, occupying Japan, for example. So that was one element. But I think the element which strikes me most particularly is that the United States wanted to use the atom bomb to show that it had it and to demonstrate its power in the Cold War world. And that is also very widely recognized by historians and indeed by significant politicians at that time in 1945, and people described it as not so much the last act of the Second World War, but the first act of the Cold War. They were sending a message to the Soviet Union about the power that they had, and another historian described it as, kind of atomic diplomacy, so-called, that this is what we've got, behave yourself, we have this kind of supremely powerful thing. And so they used it for those purposes. I think there were other reasons as well, terrible things like wanting to actually test such a bomb on a human population, so to speak, as if the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were somehow guinea pigs in testing these nuclear weapons. But, whatever the reason, catastrophic, hundreds of thousands of Japanese people were killed, and the impact, the kind of health consequences of those terrible crimes are still with many people in Japan today. And I would just conclude by saying that what are described as small nuclear bombs in terms of today's arsenal are actually many times greater in power than the bombs used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So you could see what a complete disaster it would be for any nuclear weapon to be used.
It's so important that we remember this historic crime, Kate. And I think, the fact that it's the United States, all this whitewashing of the United States supporting democracy and freedom around the world, they're the only country to have done this. And I think, as we discussed at the top of the show, the threat of nuclear war today, it isn't an alarmist thing to say. This is actually being discussed very prominently, and even in the mainstream Western media, in military circles. This is a really mainstream debate. And I think a lot of people would dismiss it as alarmism, but it's a lot of experts, agree with this as an assessment. So in terms of what we're doing today, campaigning on the issue of nuclear weapons, this is obviously a really important struggle. And CND is campaigning particularly against US nukes in Britain. So you've been warning since April 2022 that there's growing evidence that the US is intending to use RAF Lakenheath as a major part of NATO's nuclear weapons infrastructure in Europe. And I just wondered if you could talk to the significance of this issue. How much does this move by the US sort of reflect the extent to which the United States is dictating British foreign policy? What are the dangers of it? And importantly, how can we get involved in CND's campaign against this?
I mean, obviously, the US and UK are very, very closely tied together in many, many ways. This so-called special relationship, which British leaders certainly think a lot of, even though it's clear that US leaders don't necessarily think a lot of it. They just... Anyway, but Britain's got a historically very long nuclear agreement with the United States. It was signed in 1958. Its kind of short title is the Mutual Defence Agreement. It's the most far-reaching and extensive nuclear sharing and cooperation agreement that exists in the world today. And it's also thought to underpin that kind of closeness of US and UK foreign policy as well. But the thing to note about this, before I go on to talk about Lakenheath a bit, is that every 10 years, this so-called mutual defence agreement comes up for renewal in both administrations, in Congress and in the British Parliament. And this year is the moment when it gets renewed for another 10 years. And we are trying to raise awareness of this. We're trying to work with parliamentary CND, with our very supportive MPs in Parliament, cross-party MPs in Parliament, to actually get a debate tabled on this so it doesn't just go through on the nod. Because what happens is they do this thing called, they put it on the table, whatever that means, it's there. And under the parliamentary rules, things that are treaties that are on the table, they are kind of priority status for getting a debate in Parliament. But people don't necessarily take it up. That's the problem. The problem is getting MPs to really be seized of the issue, and maybe against the wishes of their own leaders in Parliament or whatever, but to really get that raised. So it's not just approaching World War III. We don't just want it going through on the nod that Britain and the US are tied at the hip in terms of nuclear weapons and nuclear policy. So that's one thing that we're trying to do. So people will find in weeks to come, they'll find stuff on the CND website about that and actions that you can take to really be pushing back on the renewal of this so-called mutual defence agreement. So that agreement is basically underpins the relationship, and one of the relationships, and there are other treaties from those years like the 50s and so on, which essentially allowed the US to run and control military facilities in Britain. And there are a number of, and I'm not even going to talk about the fact that Britain's nuclear weapons system, Trident, which is located up in Faslane and so on in Scotland, that is a kind of bit of a co-production with the United States. I'll leave that to one side because this is a kind of a new thing. So there are various bases which are basically may as well be bits of the United States in Britain. And one of those is RAF Lakenheath in West Suffolk, sort of almost equidistant, say, between Norwich and Cambridge. And that airbase, in our movement, in the peace movement, people actually like to call it USAF Lakenheath, United States Air Force Lakenheath, because the Brits have basically got no control whatsoever over it. Now, for quite a long time, US nuclear weapons were located in Lakenheath, and they were withdrawn in 2008 as a result of sustained protest there. So CND and our local allies have been working very hard, doing a lot of campaigning there. It's also in the context of the huge anti-war movement at that time following on the Iraq War. So they removed those nuclear weapons. Those nuclear weapons are part of a whole class of nuclear weapons that are located across Western Europe and in Turkey. So these are B-61 bombs. They are so-called gravity bombs or airdrop bombs. So it's not like Trident, where you put a warhead on a missile and you fire the missile thousands of miles intercontinental. These bombs, you put them on a plane, you drive over somewhere and you drop it. Okay, so it's slightly kind of old kit in a way. But nevertheless, these weapons are located in Western Europe primarily. Countries in Western Europe that host them have tried on a number of occasions to get rid of them, passing laws through Parliament and all that kind of thing. But the US has refused to remove them because they say that now, actually, they're NATO bombs, and NATO works by consensus. So in places like Belgium and Germany and so on have done this, tried to get rid of them. But no, because other NATO states want to keep them, sorry, you have to keep them. So there's no sovereignty, national sovereignty allowed in this whatsoever. And in fact, it was most recently in Germany that they tried to get rid of these nuclear weapons. And on this occasion, actually, which sort of gives the lie to the previous position, the Americans said, well, we can take them away, but if we do, we'll put them in Poland, and that'll make the situation even worse, vis-a-vis Russia. So it's clearly nothing to do with a NATO consensus. It's just what the US wants to do. Anyway, so all those are being upgraded. They're now guided bombs, B-61-12s. They're going to be launched from the new F-35s, which are coming to Western Europe, coming to Lakenheath. They're already in Lakenheath. So massive upgrading of this technology. And as part of this, they are going to bring them back, or they are trying to go and bring them back to Lakenheath. So we'll be bristling with nuclear weapons. Bad on a whole range of factors. So putting us on the nuclear front line, of course, that's very bad. Threat to local communities in particular, danger of accidents. You've got a load of nuclear weapons there. That's I don't need to spell out why that's not great for the people of East Anglia. But yes, this is bad. When challenged in Parliament by parliamentary CND members, we don't comment on these things. We either confirm nor deny the presence of nuclear weapons and so on. So British parliamentarians have had no prior notice. They're entitled to no explanation or commentary. It's this agreement with the United States basically handing over part of our country to them to do what they want with. You know, that kind of trumps all national sovereignty and the rights of British parliamentarians. So pretty disgraceful, I'm sure everyone will agree. And it has already had a very negative impact in terms of proliferation in Europe, because when this was first kind of made public, there was a well-known researcher, Hans Christensen, just found this out by reading through US Department of Defense documents, which kind of suddenly had appeared money for this at Lakenheath appeared on, so that's how people found out about it and how it became made public. So then the Russian government then said, well, this is a big escalation, the upgrading of the weapons in Europe, bringing nukes back to Britain. This is an escalation. You claim that you can do it for various reasons legally, so we're going to do it in Belarus. If it's okay for you, it's okay for us. So now Russia has put a similar kind of category nuclear weaponry in Belarus. Terrible. So that is the kind of further escalation in this terrible war. So it shows how important it is to take action to prevent them coming to Lakenheath. That's obviously crucial. We work closely with the campaigns at the other bases across Europe. We've had them coming over and joining us at our protests. But it also shows how important it is for peace negotiations to end the war on Ukraine. Absolutely crucial. Terrible suffering caused to the Ukrainian people. The terrible, terrible sights you see in the communities there in Ukraine and innocent civilians being killed. And also the kind of terrible loss of life in both of those armies, the military deaths in the Ukrainian army, the terrible military deaths in the Russian army. People just want their sons and daughters to come home safe. This is the reality. They don't want people being sent off to kill and be killed in that way. So that war has to end, and there has to be a proper political settlement so that the rights of all minorities are respected and recognized in Ukraine in those contested areas. So yeah, that's what's absolutely essential. There has to be an end to that war. There has to be an end to the provocation like US nukes coming to Lakenheath that put us all at risk. So I'm pleased to say that there's a lot of campaigning going on there. Recently, we had a peace camp there at Lakenheath, which got a lot of national coverage. So we are actually raising awareness of what is going on. There's going to be another peace camp in the months ahead. We're going to have regular vigils taking place there to raise awareness too. And we feel, there's a very strong trend in the peace movement that feels it's important to actually go to the site of where the crimes will be coming from. The crime is, and will people go out from there with these terrible bombs. So we have to actually go there, raise awareness of the site, and just say, no, we're not accepting it. We're not having this coming back here. So we're also having another national demonstration there in early November too. So if any of you people listening and watching want to get involved, please do go to the CND website, come to Lakenheath, join us there and find every way you can of opposing that, and also of opposing the war in Ukraine too, making sure we bring that to a speedy, peaceful settlement.
Wow. Thank you for that. We will be posting information about your efforts as well. We'd love to. I don't want to make promises on behalf of Fiona, but we've discussed coming to cover it. So we're excited to do that. But shifting gears a moment to another target of U.S. aggression, which you've already mentioned, is of course China. A significant moment of this U.S. aggression came in 2021 with the creation of AUKUS, a trilateral security partnership between Australia, UK, and the United States. This agreement involves the U.S. and Britain transferring tons of weapons-grade, highly enriched uranium to Australia, a non-nuclear state. And new plans were announced this year to invite Japan into AUKUS in a move which has been criticized as an attempt by the US to create an Asian NATO. Can you explain what AUKUS actually is and what you think the US and Britain are trying to achieve with this?
Yeah, so this is a trilateral alliance. Essentially, I think the overarching thing is to kind of pull Australia into the US political and military framework more than it has been. I think it's had pretty constructive relations with China. It's a kind of very big and not that far away neighbour in global terms. So that's been, they've had constructive relationships. So I think now the US is with its kind of global thing going on, global NATO, global US reach. They're trying to alter that. And this has been the way it's attempting to do that. And of course, it kind of pulls Britain in for a bit of cover, making it seem like some friendly white colonial settler type alliance, whatever. But anyway, Britain's being brought in, doesn't really have so much to offer, obviously. But the main thing about this, or certainly it was the main thing that's been trumpeted around from the start, is that the main element has been that the US and UK will provide or facilitate Australian possession of nuclear-powered submarines. When you said at the start that thing about, I don't think they are sending highly enriched uranium per se to Australia. The highly enriched uranium is in the units that power the subs. And I think those units are being made perhaps in Rolls-Royce factory in Derby in Britain, which is where the nuclear power units for all Britain's submarines are made. But anyway, it is nevertheless, your correct point is that, this is a nuclear proliferatory thing. There should be no nuclear stuff whatsoever in Australia under international law, and sending these nuclear reactors with highly enriched uranium, which is weapons-grade uranium, it breaks all kinds of international law. So it's quite interesting that actually this was the kind of shining centerpiece of the AUKUS treaty, but in fact it became clear fairly soon that the United States didn't have any spare capacity to make nuclear subs for Australia. They didn't have the expertise to make them themselves, and Britain didn't have any spare capacity to make them either. So it was a bit a kind of, that we're saying we're going to do this, but can we deliver? Well, no, not really. So it's taken several years now to get the kind of agreement as to how that will take place. So in a few years, Australia may be able to, I think, buy a couple of old subs or something from the United States to tide them over. This is so much kind of, particularly in Britain, there's this kind of imperial-minded but complete overreach in what Britain has the capacity to do. And then in terms of Britain, so Britain has two types of nuclear-powered subs. One is the Trident submarines. That's for nuclear-powered submarines which carry nuclear weapons. And then we have another category of nuclear-powered submarines which carry conventional weapons. These are the so-called Astute-class hunter-killer submarines, and they carry conventional weapons. So Britain is still making its kind of Trident replacement submarines. Those won't be made for ages. They're always sort of running behind. And then the Astute class is still under construction as well. They've got some out there, but they still haven't finished their order for that. So it'll be quite a long time before they can then. So what's going to happen is after those are built, then Britain will start building new hunter-killer type subs, which will replace the Astute class in decades to come. And they will also make some for Australia, essentially. So it's kind of, they promise this huge thing, but it's not going to happen for ages. Well, that's good, obviously, but it's like kind of Australia, on the promise of this, has been sort of sucked into this kind of massive military thing. And so, in a sense, the nuclear aspect of it is kind of just chugging along and will take ages. In the meantime, they've just been kind of sucked into massive other amounts of nuclear stuff with the United States, primarily, and Britain to some extent. But, all kinds of things. So it's a kind of mass militarization of the relationship with Australia, and the kind of mass spending by Australia on all these useless weapons. They're either useless weapons or they're weapons that were going to get them into a bad war. That's the reality. And it just increases the tensions in the region. Why do you want Australia bristling with nuclear subs and all kinds of massively high-tech weapons? I mean, really. So I'm pleased to say that CND has been working with like-minded partner organisations in Australia to oppose this, and there's been some good trade union opposition to it. But one of the kind of problems with this is when Boris Johnson, back to Boris Johnson, his ridiculous policies, when he was unveiling this, he was kind of trying to sell it to the British public as this is going to be great for British jobs. We're going to make all these subs and, it's going to be a fantastic military economy, industrial bonanza. And that's one of the most disturbing things about what the previous government and now this government no doubt is going to do is rather than diversifying away from weapons production into things that are actually going to be useful to generate growth in our economy and provide good things for the population. It's got this ridiculous idea that we should basically be an arms-based economy, that military production is what's going to give Britain massive growth. Well, all kinds of economic reasons why arms military production don't actually create growth in the economy. It's kind of dead spending in many ways. But, that's so to kind of try and sell it as a kind of jobs making thing is just absolutely disgraceful when you can see the international impact and the terrible dangers that it brings.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a colossal waste of money. I mean, the billions that are being spent on this is just ridiculous. And like you say, hopefully they will become a useless investment. But if it becomes a useful investment, useful in what? Trying to destroy the world. I mean, this is incredibly dangerous and destabilizing the situation, kind of points in the direction of what you've been saying before about the threat of, Third World War, where we know that stopping the rise of China is the number one thing for the United States at this point. But just sort of like coming into, because you mentioned in your last answer about the new Labour government, I think at this point we're about a month and a half into this new Labour government. I was just wondering what your assessment of Britain's foreign policy is under Labour. How does it differ from the Conservatives' approach? And what are the prospects, if any, of developing a more ethical, a more peaceful and independent foreign policy?
I struggle to find any difference at all. I mean, I suppose there are some small differences around Gaza, so not blocking potential ICC arrest warrants for Netanyahu and other war criminals in the Israeli government. So that's good. But the really, really important thing to end the genocide in Gaza, they are not properly addressing, which is to kind of really massively go to town on putting international pressure on or supporting the international pressure which is on Israel to stop it, but also to stop the arms sales, stop arms trade with Israel, in both directions. And they keep on kind of sort of almost promising some little bit, but then kind of then delay it, putting it off till later, having another inquiry into it and all that sort of thing. It's just absolutely not good enough. It's just completely not good enough. And you see these terrible, terrible atrocities continuing, like, Al Tabeen, the school. It's just absolutely unbearable. So this government continues to condone and enable that. That's the reality of it, and it's completely terrible. And all I can say is that I'm so pleased that we have a number of independent MPs who've been elected to the British Parliament specifically on the grounds of Gaza, opposing the genocide and standing up now, in particular, obviously, against Labour government support for it. So thank God we've got a few more principled people in Parliament on that. So that's that situation. But then in terms of the other things, I mean, during the election campaign, it was so-called triple lock-on Trident. In other words, replacing Trident, spending loads more money on it, doing all those things. Dreadful, terrible. It's just a continuation of Tory policies. They're going to continue with the warhead increase, which Boris Johnson introduced, terrible. So Britain is part of the problem now internationally, which is that, for decades after the Cold War, the global nuclear arsenal was going down. Now it's coming up again, and Britain's warhead figures will be part of that when they are ratified or released or whatever happens. So Britain is they're basically a big part of the problem on the nuclear front. And then, of course, there's military spending. Oh, yes, we want to get to 2.5% GDP, at what cost to everything else, not to mention the fact that they're weapons for killing. So that's all bad. NATO's greatest supporter, blah, terrible. Just terrible, wanting to continue to arm Ukraine, let that war continue, rather than supporting proper political negotiations to end that war peacefully. So on every level, Labour policy is just so dreadful, really, really dreadful. They've announced that they're going to have a strategic defence review. They've issued the terms of reference last month. So that's going to look at, well, we'll get detail on what they're going to do. I have no doubt that all the stuff about developing British industry on the back of military production, that will be a factor in it too. So in short, I could say it's bad. And of course, we are, doing our campaigning work on that. An important focus for us is work in the trade union movement, because some trade unions are fantastic on that. We've got lots of trade union affiliates. But there are some trade unions who, unfortunately, have very narrowly, a couple of years ago, managed to change TUC policy on this, who now seem to subscribe to Tory, as it was then, government policy about spending more on weaponry and all that kind of thing, and, the war stuff. There's a kind of sort of phalanx in the trade union movement that is now pro-war and pro-military spending, and that is something that we have to reverse. So we have to restore, or not, well, it's still there, but we have to kind of regrow and strengthen that relationship between the peace movement and the labour movement. The values of socialism and the values of the peace movement, they are together. The origins of much of the socialist movement internationally was in opposing the First World War. That's how that kind of very, very strong anti-imperialist, anti-war trend developed out of the horrors of the First World War. The fact that, many socialist parties at that time went along with supporting their governments, in their patriotic, nationalistic, jingoistic desire to go and kill other people. But as somebody said in a TUC Congress debate on this, on military spending and so on, when it comes to a war, there's a worker on both ends of a bayonet. That's the reality. So who wants to go and die in the interests of their ruling class? That's the kind of the long-standing issue, the long-standing principle in the labour movement about war and peace.
Oh, and of course, in recent weeks, we have witnessed shocking scenes on the streets of Britain with a wave of violent attacks from the far right on Muslims, asylum seekers, and Black and Asian communities. In your capacity as General Secretary of CND, you've signed a unity statement alongside Diane Abbott, Jeremy Corbyn, Paloma Faith, trade union leaders, and others on the need to unite to stop the far right. Could you explain why it is so important for the peace and anti-war movement to be a part of this anti-fascist movement? And can you explain the links between our belligerent foreign policy and the current fascist violence we are witnessing?
Well, first of all, I would say it's important for everyone to get involved mobilising against the far right and against racism and Islamophobia. And I think, for people in the peace movement, it's just part of what we do, is try to end conflict and end hatred and so on. So it's a kind of general humanitarian thing. Let's look at the Gaza protests that the peace movement have been so centrally involved in over the last 10 months or so now, trying to end that occupation and war on the Palestinians, that's long predates the terrible genocide in Gaza, so that is. And of course, particularly for CND, our concern about Israel as a nuclear weapons state, the only nuclear weapons state in the Middle East, and so on. There is really, really strong racism and Islamophobia elements in that genocide of the Palestinians. It's absolutely fundamental to that. And the failure of all sections of our society, basically I'm talking about the political establishment and the media, their failure to oppose the genocide and demand an end to the genocide and a demand to a free and sovereign Palestine, which Palestinians can live in peace. That failure is in part due to racism and Islamophobia about the Palestinians, so those two causes, I would say, are inextricably linked. Absolutely. And then, as you said just then as well, in terms of our foreign policy as well. So the far right is obviously in Britain, it kind of hangs its kind of disgraceful, awful ideology in this era on opposition to asylum seekers, to refugees, to migrants and so on, just totally non-credible lying bases. It's just, anyway, I'm sure everyone understands that. But the fact is, so many refugees and asylum seekers have actually been created by the foreign policy, the military and foreign policy of Britain and the United States. That's the reality of it. There are hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people worldwide who would far rather not have to leave home, take their children long distances in incredibly dangerous circumstances, maybe dying on the way, but they don't have any choice because of what we have done to their countries. That's the reality of it, so it's like the hypocrisy and just terribleness of firstly the far right and people like Farage and all the people, that's kind of thugs and rabble that are mobilized on the ground, on these kind of racist and far right bases, but also people in the establishment who kind of buy into that, and allow their policies to be shaped by that far right lies and vitriol and hate. It's just unspeakably terrible, which is why it's absolutely crucial that everyone has to mobilise against the far right. Everyone has to mobilise against the genocide in Gaza, and everyone has to mobilise against war and nuclear weapons. As the slogan goes, one, we are the people, because we are the people who are going to be killed, destroyed. Everything that we hold dear is going to be brought down in ruins by governments, parties, spurious so-called movements that push this kind of terrible propaganda and ideology, and we have to stand up together against it, be as united as is absolutely humanly possible.
100%. And that kind of brings us on also to our last question, Kate, which is in this context where we have, the horrific situation in Palestine with the Western-backed, really, Israeli genocide that's taking place. We've got the escalation of NATO's proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. We've also got the military build-up against China as well. So we've got Britain playing a role in all of these conflicts. So what would your parting message be in terms of how we grow the anti-war movement in this moment, which is, I think, a very historic, important moment to be building a movement to kind of stop this push really to a third world war?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what has really made an impact, I think, is the mass mobilizations for Gaza. And we haven't yet pushed the government hard enough or far enough. I mean, the balance of forces maybe is on their side, but for the moment. But the fact is, we have had some significant victories, in terms of them trying to stop us marching. There was all the kind of fiasco last November with Suella Braverman trying to mobilise the far right against us, trying to stop us marching. That all came to nothing. The attempts to stop us to having a slogan from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, attempts to stop that completely dropped, so that's not to rest on our laurels, of course, because there were, obviously counter-protests continue. But nevertheless, we will not be silenced. That's the next bit of the slogan goes. And that will continue. And the more people that come out and do those things, the better. But it's not just going on the marches. It's taking action in your workplace, in your school or your educational place of education, all kinds of different ways. And I think really getting this through the trade unions is crucial as well. I mean, there are so many people in different walks of life who can take action to change the situation. So we've seen the impact of civil servants, refusing to process the arms licenses. And then there's some of the sort of successes for the BDS movement and getting divestment and so on. So doing those things on all those levels. And the same applies to the other conflicts as well, and to nuclear weapons. It's to get active in whichever way you can to really kind of maximise that really a crucial public and political pressure on government. And then, of course, as well as that, it's to get involved in discussions, and get involved in reading about what's going on and writing about what's going on and doing podcasts about what's going on, so people are informed and they understand what is going on in the world. I mean, that's the most, for me, that, yes, absolutely, taking action is the crucial thing. But it's always been so important to me to understand what is actually going on in the world. What are the global dynamics? Because we've talked about all the bad things today. That's what we're here to talk about. But there are great dynamics going on as well in the global south. There are fantastic initiatives against nuclear weapons from the states of the global south. There are all kinds of positive things. We are, as this is called, the global majority. We are the global majority. And so it's like realizing our power and seizing it and taking action, understanding it. So people don't just think, oh, we've got a problem here with some right-wing rioters. What are we going to do? So you have some kind of localized response. Okay, you do need a local pushback, absolutely. But you have to understand the bigger picture, what is going on in Britain and why. And what is going on in the world and why. So that's the thing, to have that analysis and understanding. And when you have a really good, clear analysis that's correct and bears out what is going on, then you can work out the right policies to deal with it, and you can have a strategy that can be effective, and then that combined with the action and the mass mobilization, that's what can really take our movements forward.
Well, excellent. I think people listening today, Kate, will have definitely grasped more about what's going on in the world. And that's kind of what we're trying to do here, because I think there's so much disinformation and propaganda that's taking place. But like you said, look outside of this island, Britain, and around the world in terms of the global south, and you'll see a different picture. And I think that's so important to emphasize, actually, that we can feel like the whole world is all for war. And actually, that's completely rubbish. Not only is there a majority for peace in this country, despite all the propaganda, but actually internationally, we're part of a global majority. And that's so important in terms of giving us that confidence to take action. Like, we're not alone. We are part of that international movement.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Kate. I feel inspired, maybe. Inspired to continue, at least. So thank you so much for coming on our show. It's an absolute pleasure. And thank everyone for watching. We have the housekeeping stuff to say. Like and subscribe and comment and, start a discussion about what you feel strongly about. And also see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Kate.
Bye.